Welcome back to the greenhouse. If you're new here, welcome aboard. Thank you for checking this video out. Today we're going to be discussing cheap shade cloths versus expensive shade cloths, and I want to do a little bit of talking before we get into actually checking these shade cloths out. Now, if that sounds interesting, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe. Let's get into this. So what is the purpose of a shade cloth, and why do we use them, and how do we use them? So shade cloths are to block that brutal summer sun. We start with our shade cloths in the early spring just to give all of our market crops a better start from the brutal sun. The sun really heats this greenhouse up. It could be 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside and be 80 to 100 in here depending on how sunny it is. So we use shade cloths to protect all of these potted market crops. I've got some lemongrass here. Now this would just get absolutely baked in here without any shade cloths. Using these shade cloths allow 20 to 30 degrees cooler than the outside temperatures in the sun, and sometimes even more. And as I was sharing, I got my dog here. I got all of these potted plants, as I was saying, and the potted plants, these 3x3 square inch pots, are much more susceptible to drying out and baking in the sun, and the greenhouse has its own environment. So if we don't come in and water for a couple days to a week, these will all just be baked and dry out. Having these shade cloths allow a lot more moisture retention along with lower temperatures. So how do these shade cloths work? So they're basically just filtering light, and these ones on here are 20% shade cloths. And they're basically just reenacting the filtered light from leaves of a canopy. So on the edge of a forest, you're going to have different crops than out in the center of a savanna or a Great Plain. There's a huge difference in the moisture retention and the light that is getting to the crop. So we're just using these shade cloths as an artificial canopy, an artificial light filter. And we generally do not want to exceed 20 to 30% shade. So we want 70 to 80% of light coming through, even on these potted crops. And that is very true for any fruiting crops or your leafy greens. The leafy greens versus fruiting crops, you could probably get away with 40 to 50% shade cloth, honestly, with lettuce, kales, all of the kind of leafier green stuff, onions and stuff. But if you have a fruiting crop, you want as much sunlight as possible, and 20% is about the sweet spot for those fruiting vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and things alike. You can get away with no shade cloth as long as you've got plenty of ventilation. This greenhouse is an exception to the rule because we built it to be a winter bunker for a greenhouse as cheap as we possibly could, spending $1,500 to $1,600 on 2 layers of poly, 6 mil poly, and we've got ourselves 520 square feet. So all winter long, we're growing ourselves food. You can hear my solar powered fan kicking on to ventilate, and that is how we're ventilating the greenhouse. We leave the doors, windows open, and we're using solar power to use fans to cool the greenhouse at the same time. Normally, a kit would allow you to roll the sides up, or you would have more ventilation. We've got our minimum amount of ventilation exceeded with our doors and windows, but it still does get very hot in here without a shade cloth on. So if you found yourself asking, man, should I buy the $30 shade cloth or should I buy the $130 shade cloth? 20 by 20 and 20 by 20. So comparable, the same size shade cloths, but a whole $100 in difference. So I found myself asking the same thing. And on this channel, we like to do everything as cheap as possible. So what I did was bought the cheap shade cloths, and I've been using them for a couple years, and I've had to replace 2 of them already. So we've almost equaled the one expensive shade cloth with 3 or 4 of the cheaper ones. So that being said, the durability is the #1 factor on these shade cloths. I'm gonna show these 2 shade cloths, and then we're gonna go check out outside the greenhouse where we had wind rip our cheap shade cloths because the material they're made from is not the same and they do not compare. So looking down here at this brand new that I haven't pulled out yet, this one was $30, $32. Now you can see it is just like a polyethylene or whatever, just a cheap material. It's basically like those sandbags. And you saw what happened with our sandbags that were in the sun over there. They biodegrade very quickly in the UV light in the sunlight. Now, this is a 20 by 20, and like I said, we spent $30 on it, and it may be going up to replace the tear in our shade cloth you can see here for a temporary period the rest of the summer. Now, here is a expensive $130 shade cloth. Now, you can look at like Bootstrap Farmer. That's one of the main ones you would find. Tractor Supply has them, but you want to be aware of the percentage of light that it actually filters. So zooming in very closely, you can see this is a much different material than the cheap shade cloth. So side by side, zoomed in, you can see the good quality versus the poor quality. So shade cloths are very important to a greenhouse and the ecosystem you have inside of it. What have you been eating?
Lemongrass.
Lemongrass. It allows us to keep all of these crops from baking out. Now we just built ourselves a little shade house out here. We're sitting about 71 degrees right here. So we're sitting about 71 degrees Fahrenheit in the greenhouse. There's a big old tractor. And we're sitting about 83 degrees Fahrenheit outside. So that leads us to about 12 degrees difference. So I used one of our cheap shade cloths because I had bought a few of them. Now, I just want to show, it's just like a giant birdhouse in here. And I'm not finished. I just threw my shade cloth up. This is the only loose side right now. And my son decided to put himself a small birdhouse over there. Obviously, we built it nice and sturdy. He's able to stand on it here. So it is much cooler right here than it is in the direct sunlight where all of our crops are sitting. We are about to be putting all of our straw down. We've got a farmer who does not spray his straw, so we're gonna grab a bunch of bales. They are a little more expensive, but I do not want chemicals put down on our crops with the straw. So as we fill in the rows around all of our tomatoes and peppers and stuff, we want to use something that is not going to poison the ecosystem of our soil to allow it to grow a little better. I can just pop right under. Down here, scooting out underneath the bench, I realized my son was putting sage flowers all over, probably trying to ward off demons or something. Anyway, let's jump over here. We've got our cheap shade cloth, and man, the last 70 mile an hour, we had like tornado warnings and crap. So this is just popping. Very poor quality. For $30, I wasn't expecting much, but we also have this shade cloth over here that is not the right size for our greenhouse, but it does work very well. And it is just so much heavier, so much thicker, and it does not rip. It is just as old as that one, and you can see the difference. There is no tears. There is no UV degradation like on this one. You can see that the degradation is terrible everywhere. It just wants to rip apart, leaves plastic pieces. So we want to do away with these. We're going to be reinvesting our farmers market money into better shade cloths for the greenhouse. And I figured I would share this with everybody to save them a little bit of headache. I mean, if you're in a bind and you really got to use the cheaper ones, that's what we did. And we've done it for a few years now and they've worked. But we've also been using the more expensive ones as an experiment, and they work a lot better and they last a lot longer. The durability, I mean, we take them down every fall, put them up every spring, and there is just a huge difference in the two. Spending a little bit of extra money up front is going to save you a lot of headache in the backside when you're taking them down and they start to fall apart and rip. And then you've got pieces of plastic flying throughout your garden. It's just not a good situation. So I wanted to share our thoughts, experiences. My son loves his little shade house here. We've got a lot of work to do with it, and I did use a cheaper shade cloth, so that may not even last the entire summer. I have it strapped down pretty tight on the top and side. So just tacking down the front side, we've got it kind of just haphazardly put together right now, but it is working quite well for storing bikes. And we've got a few plants. We were out planting this morning early. We seriously need some rain, and it is coming this week. We've got about 3 days of rain, but the temperatures are getting up there. So 80s and 90s are definitely drying the soil out, and with the extra wind, it is just pulling the moisture right out. So getting that ground cover down, some straw, is going to really benefit our crops and benefit the harvests that we can get from them later on in the season here. So with that, I'm gonna let you guys go, and I'll bring an update on this whole little shade house itself. And you can see this whole backside of the shade house is completely open because the sun comes straight up in the summertime. So we don't have to worry about any sunlight infiltrating in here. We just wanted all of these crops that we're going to be putting on these benches. We're going to put some pallets in here and make little tables. We're going to bring an update on this as it develops here. So I'd like to thank you guys for checking this one out. And if you have any questions, definitely drop them in the comments below. We will see you in the next video.